The growing power of and access to technologies has led to significant shifts in the way politics and conflict are conducted. We've seen a shift, haven't we, in the centre of gravity of war from the battlefield on the physical ground to the virtual battlefield, otherwise known as cyber war. But what is cyber warfare? We're going to join Senior Lecturer in Global Security at King's College London, Tim Stevens, Senior Researcher at the Centre for Security Studies, Max Smeets, and researcher at the NATO Cooperative Cyber Defence Centre of Excellence, Piret Pernik, as they discuss cyber warfare and the future of international security.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon if you're in Europe, at least. Good evening, good morning for those of you in the rest of the world. But welcome to the panel. I'm Dr. Tim Stevens. I'm Senior Lecturer in the Department of War Studies at King's College London in the UK and head of its Cybersecurity Research Group. With me, we have Dr. Max Smeets, who's Senior Researcher at the Centre for Security Studies at ETH Zurich in Switzerland and also co-founder and director the European Cyber Conflict Research Initiative, ECRI. We also have joining us very, very shortly, Piret Pernik, who is a researcher in the strategy branch at the NATO Cooperative Cyber Defence Centre of Excellence in Tallinn, Estonia. And both Max and Piret are very highly respected analysts of and commentators on cyber affairs. And we're very privileged to have them on today's panel. And just by means of a very, very brief setup, for the panel, I mean, it'll be apparent to anyone on this call and indeed attending this event that we're living through a period during which the global information space is an environment of persistent competition, if not outright conflict. And that, of course, involves a range of different types of actors in that space, most notably, of course, states who have their own kind of ongoing hostilities, if you like, but also between states and a host of other actors. Terrorists, potentially criminals, proxy actors, including what people are calling cyber mercenaries, and indeed firms as well. And each of those actors is seeking strategic or economic advantage in various ways. The topic of today's panel, therefore, is both timely and important. And we've been given the title of Cyber War and the Future of International Security. And the way it's going to work today is that I'm going to ask each of our panelists to address this theme for 5 to 7 minutes, after which we will have time for reflection and discussion, which will involve a few comments from me, but mainly questions from the audience. So I'm going to ask Max to kick us off, if you wouldn't mind. Max Smeets, you're very welcome, and very much looking forward to hearing what you have to say to us today. Over to you.
Thank you, Tim, for your always kind introductions. It's a real pleasure to be on this panel with you, and hopefully Piret can join us soon to talk also about the role of NATO in this space. You yourself have written an article a couple of years ago, I believe in 2013 or 2014, with David Betts on the use of analogies and metaphors when we discuss cybersecurity. And in your article, you talk about spatial analogies and biological analogies, if I'm correct. But today I want to start off this conversation on how we talk about cyber conflict using a different analogy, one from gaming. More specifically, I think cyber conflict can be viewed as either a game of poker, a game of chess, or a game of Go. Of course, each of these three analogies have their limitations, but I think it's a good starting point for this conversation. When we think about cyber conflict as a game of poker, then it's a competition of risk-taking, right? And that's the idea of states making gains through coercion, through signaling, and through establishing credibility. And from this perspective, if you think about it on cyber conflict, it's mostly about these highly disruptive and destructive operations that can potentially signal someone's willingness on where red lines are, on coerce another actor of not doing something. You want to really respond forcefully, and vice versa. You want to make sure that you create a certain credibility that the other doesn't do so. When we think about it as a game of chess, it's a different idea. In that case, cyber conflict is a competition in much more tactical cleverness. I like the words of Dan Almond, who talks about this of advancing without attacking, right? And advancing without attacking is possible when there is a way to take something without having to overtly attack. And the key here is to prevail in a crisis that unfolds actually along the kind of these red lines, and to exploit these opportunities that exist to outmaneuver the adversary. And from this perspective, cyber conflict is much more about operations below the threshold of armed attack, right? But that can cumulatively still be impactful. So from this perspective, you also want to use the seams maybe of bureaucratic politics that is going on internally within a country or internationally, and think through, hey, how can I make sure that responses are minimized? How can I make sure that I still achieve my strategic gains without this kind of overt and clear potential aggression that some people may perceive to be the case? And then lastly, you have this notion of cyber conflict as a game of Go. Go is I guess, less not as often, not as popular in the West, although it is changing now. I think it originated in Japan, and it's this abstract strategy board game for two players, in which each aims to surround the other with more territory than the other. So the general strategy is simply to expand your territory and to attack your opponent's kind of weak groups. And the interesting part of this game, of course, is the real early placement of certain stones in that game has great implications for what's happening later in that game. Now, if you think about cyber conflict as a game of Go, then again, the lens has changed, right? And then it's about controlling the critical nodes. It's about making sure that you think far in advance. It's less about, these potential tit-for-tat cyber operations and these individual cases of maybe some data is stolen or some effect is achieved, but it's about owning that infrastructure. It's about being in that game. And of course, there we can think about whether your country owns the most important hardware companies or software companies, or maybe even gaming companies, given the amount of data that is being transferred through those. We can think about the cases such as 5G infrastructure or the crypto AG case. Now, the last point to make here is what I think is interesting is that for a very long time, I think the general focus has been on cyber conflict as a game of poker. And that's maybe because of our initial, Cold War thinking that was like being pushed onto cyber, and we thought about, hey, how can we signal with operations? How can we achieve deterrence? How can we make sure that other actors are compelled? And slowly we see this shift, although surely, towards these two other forms of cyber conflict. And I wouldn't say that everyone has been well adjusted to them, and that's something potentially to discuss also later in the NATO context. But I think it's important to consider, from my perspective, that all three exist. But if anything, the second and the third one are more important. I'll leave it there for now, but I would love to hear your views on that as well.
Great, thank you, Max. So, you were pointing actually to what I was going to ask you. If you're a relatively well-equipped, well-resourced country that's got a stake in this game space, if you like. So you're engaging with various types of adversary at all times. Are you trying to play all three of these games at the same time?
That's a very good question. I'm not sure. There is you can say two ways, right? You can potentially play different games against different actors at the same time, or maybe even the same game against one actor. I do think that they're not mutually exclusive. But the reason why I'm cautious in answering is my current thinking is what might be going on is one actor might be thinking they're playing one game, and the other actor might be thinking that they're playing another game. And that's the most dangerous form of cyber conflict that exists, right? So. Absolutely. a potential European approach that I think we've seen for a long time, which was very much around the signaling notion. And I think the cyber diplomacy toolbox is specifically designed for that. It's a signaling device, and that has different, it's basically a ladder of different options to do depending on how you see this case escalates. But you want to create a credible response and hopefully never actually execute it. And you want to publish the EU cyber diplomacy toolbox and the options you have to respond, because again, you see this very much as a game of credibility. But if your other actor, a Russian actor, is not playing a game of poker, but playing a game of chess, explicitly using those red lines which exist or are not there, I think that is very, very dangerous. And so that doesn't perfectly answer your question, because it was on whether you can do it multiple times. But I think the most dangerous one is the mismatch. Now, when you then think empirically more directly towards the question, yes, I do think that we see actors playing these multiple games and then at the same time. And the US, I think, is a clear example for that. And I think that is done sometimes intentionally, but also often very unintentionally, right? And of course, not perfectly at the same time, but it is because of potential different institutions, and NSA, a cyber command, and what White House wants to do, trying to operate in this space at the same time, trying to achieve their gains, which is very hard to then read for adversaries. So the point there is, I think empirically you can say, yes, the US was involved in crypto AG. Yes, it is constantly thinking about how to shape this space. Yes, it does. It has conducted cyber operations against Russia in many ways to signal. It has also tried to cause friction below the threshold of armed attack. So yes, it is playing these multiple games, but I don't know if it is doing that intentionally or unintentionally.
Sure. And of course, it may be that individual organizations on the same side are also playing slightly different games from their neighbors and neighboring organizations, which has created problems in the past between CIA and NSA and so on.
Absolutely. And of course, your responses, as we mentioned, will change. I think even how you view the game yourself will change how you respond to it. So even if the action itself doesn't change, I think there are some. My girlfriend, she's an economics graduate, and she talks about all these ideas in economics on whether you see this as a zero-sum game or a positive-sum game. Even if the game itself hasn't changed, but just your perception will change how you share, how you will respond, how you will behave. And I think that's something you will see here as well. If everyone believes it's a signaling game, even though it isn't, then they will respond with signaling measures and vice versa.
Sure. I mean, are you detecting, for example, perhaps even with the new American approach, are you detecting a greater appreciation, shall we say, for the game of Go than perhaps the game of poker? Are you seeing those shifts in doctrine, for example?
I think we do. I think, of course, the US approach most famously over the last 3 years has explicitly shifted away from mostly seeing this as a game of poker to at least a game of chess. And we can talk about the game of Go, right? Seeing this as an operational domain where activity is taking place below the threshold of armed attack, where different adversaries can still have strategic gains, whether that is Russia through information operations, where maybe one tweet is not sufficient to respond to, but a whole information campaign can really influence the democratic institutions on which, of course, the United States is based, China from its intellectual property perspective, and potentially also other actors, whether that's North Korea, from trying to achieve strategic gains through even simply criminal activity to collect Bitcoin for what some would argue their security programs, or Iran. Now, the US has then, as a result of that, implemented a new vision of persistent engagement and defend forward, where they seek to cause friction against their adversaries. So the goal here is not to deter, it's not to change the cost-benefit calculation of the actors, but it is to cause friction, i.e. it is to take the capabilities away of the adversaries. Now, one of the open questions here is, where are the red lines, right? If you believe you're playing a game of chess that is below the threshold of attack, and you believe that others are maybe using these unclear red lines that exist, you'll have to be clear, like at least not in public, but at least in your within your security establishment as to what you're going to respond to and not, and that's a difficult question. Just to add one more point here, what I think we see in Europe is a slightly different one, and of course now with the UK maybe is an exception, but I think at least implicitly I feel, and tell me what you think, that we've seen this shift, that yes, there is now this awareness about below the threshold activity that is at least as consequential. And yet, it hasn't really implemented, I would say, clear solutions or strategies to deal with that. Now, I'm not saying it should follow the US approach of persistent engagement and defend forward, but there is no real alternative there. My sense is that there is at the moment a misbalance, that on the one hand, they are aware that it's, again, kind of more of a game of chess, and yet the solutions they propose fit with the solutions of a game of poker.
I think that's a reasonable observation, Max, actually. And what's really, I mean, I think maybe they're playing three-dimensional space chess, you know, kind of something you might see in sci-fi. There is that awareness, but yet the language, I mean, for example, the UK yesterday came out with its much sort of heralded integrated review of foreign policy, security and defense, and something called the National Cyber Force is part of that kind of review process. It's existed for a while, but it's up front and center as something, as an organization that's been set up specifically to engage, you know, to deny, to degrade, and so on. But principally, it's there to deter, right? It's part of the kind of deterrence paradigm that we've been used to for quite a long time. But I do detect some shifts in UK thinking on this to something that looks more like the US persistent engagement. I think the word they're using is creative, which is a way of squaring away the fact that their closest ally has come up with this persistent engagement defending forward thing they're not entirely happy with under international law, but they're coming up with a British kind of response to it.
I think so too, and that you see it in certain sentences. So they use the word persistent engagement, I believe 5 or 6 times in the document, but then they also say persistent engagement to deter. There is exactly that phrase in there, which is not how the US uses it, right? So I think it's a really, really interesting observation you made there, and I fully agree.
Excellent. Thank you, Max. Piret, welcome.
Thank you very much. I apologize for technical problems. I don't know what happened.
No, that's okay. It's great to see you. So if you don't mind, I introduced you earlier and your job as a researcher at NATO CCD COE in Tallinn. Max gave us a little presentation there on sort of gaming analogies through which to look through the lens, use as lenses through which to look at cyber conflict. And we can come back to some of those themes in the Q&A perhaps. But in the meantime, I'd very much like to hear from you. So the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I will be brief. Hopefully, I will make 3 points and illustrate them with examples of cyber operations. And as I'm in Tallinn, I will mainly focus on Russia. So the first point is that cyber warfare is not a helpful concept to understand the real power constellation of nation states. And perhaps this argument is trivial, but I think it's still worth to call that analogous from conventional warfare are imperfect to describe interstate shaping and contesting in cyberspace. Labels such as cyber warfare and cyber weapons are often used to advance specific interests and necessarily do not grasp in enough precision the nature of episodic and cumulative long-term cyber campaigns executed largely by the intelligence and military services and their proxies. The effects of cyber attacks are rarely the same as in kinetic operations, thus focus on casualties and large-scale physical damage neglects the indirect harms that cyber operations more often yield. We should be asking what other types of harms cyber operations, either standalone or combined with other non-kinetic operations, can cause. However, these concepts are useful in the context of warfare in terms of battlefield in a cyber and multi-domain environments. And for military planning at operational level. So recognizing that, some scholars and practitioners prefer more nuanced terms such as rivalry, persistent competition and engagements, which I already heard was mentioned, signaling, shaping, contesting, and coercing. So I would illustrate how imperfect the notion of cyber war is by an example of Estonia's cyber attacks in 2007, which at the time were considered cyber war and cyber terrorists by many. So they were notable globally as part of political tensions with Russia, but the costs borne by the society were mainly social and psychological, and the economic costs were negligible. In contrast, a recent FireEye Mandiant report outlines an influence campaign dubbed Ghostwriter, conducted between 2017 and 20 in Lithuania, Latvia, and Poland, which aligned with Russia's security interests and disseminated anti-NATO disinformation. With rather sophisticated methods compared to what was used back in 2007, such as website compromises, spoofed email accounts, also falsified documents, and creation of 14 inauthentic online personas. In terms of shaping public opinion in favor of Russia's interest, this latter campaign, in my view, can be viewed as one episode of the broader long-term anti-Western, anti-NATO influence campaign, and speculatively have had much larger effects during those 3 years. And we can also imagine that in the future, Russia and other adversaries can use machine learning and deepfakes and massive orchestration of inauthenticated personas, etc. So the strategic impact could be something considered perhaps information warfare or cyber warfare, if you will. And but in the final point of this, for example, if you use Google research, then you will achieve only 500 results of Ghostwriter, whereas if you use Estonia Cyber War, you will receive 1.5 million results. So that is not, of course, scientific investigation. So the second point is that I think some very interesting activities happening below the radar, and we need to connect the dots better. Here I refer to some maybe less sexy activities, such as, for example, the overtake of internet infrastructure, as we saw in Russia's activities in Crimea in 2014, where they took over routing to autonomous systems. Also, I refer to, for example, recently reported Chinese state actors conducting cyber espionage against Western 5G technology companies, also various activities in technical standards, internet governance arrangements, and global norms fora. So these may have actually longer-term strategic effects, but not so widely in public discourse and academic writings, perhaps. And so my point is that in order to fully grasp the nature of cyber contesting below the threshold of use of force, which is the dominant form of interstate cyber activity. We should better connect technical analysis, such as done in the Mandiant report or other US indictments, to connect with the more strategic level geopolitical examination of foreign relations and international politics. But of course, it's a very difficult thing to do. So the real cyber war may be happening, but it's more stealthy and receives less attention. And another example I want to bring is Ukrainian electric grid attacks in 2015 and 16. I'm not going to go into the details, but the point is that both malwares used were quite sophisticated, and they were high degree of orchestration was between different stages of cyber kill chain during those campaigns. And notably, these malwares and attacks were attributed in October 2020 to 6 GRU officers by the Department of Justice. Among other attacks by those same perpetrators, such as NotPetya and WADA and Winter Olympic Games, etc. Around the same time, Department of Treasury attributed Triton and Akatrisis malware that was designed against the industrial safety system and used against the petrochemical utility in Middle East in 2017, also to the Russian military. So my point is that, of course, I'm speculating, but we could use those data to actually examine how that industrial crash override malware that was used in 2016 and which was automated a modular malware designed against certain protocols and Siemens industrial control systems were developed further, possibly by the same group, to use against the US electric grid, because the Triton malware was also, or at least the same group, was scanning and probing US electric grid. And I don't see very much connecting those dots in analysis. I also wanted to mention regarding the Russian capabilities that, in fact, is that we don't know very much about their actual capabilities, organization structure, and strategic culture. There have been some articles, especially in Cycon books and by my own organization. But what we can see is that even if, according to Belfer Center 2020 National Cyberpower Index, Russia is placed third in the area of the use of offensive cyber capabilities after US and UK. In the area of foreign military and government intelligence collection capabilities, they are only on the 10th place after Five Eyes countries. So the point is that even though Russia may have limitations in its security service capabilities and resources, it nevertheless, as many scholars have pointed out, it has much lower par for employing them for destructive cyber operations. And my final point is that also maybe a little bit technical term, which each scholar interprets differently, cyber threat intelligence needs to be more utilized. And by this, I mean that we shouldn't consider maybe cyber attacks as isolated events, but look at longer campaigns and compare different countries, different times. For example, Russian combined cyber kinetic activities in Georgia and Crimea. So how were these experiences translated into the use of cyber espionage against NGOs and political opposition in Syria in 2016? So do we have a really understanding how those TTPs are evolving. And finally, just to conclude that, of course, the role and impact of cyber operations will grow in the future. However, I agree with other scholars that escalation to conventional or nuclear warfare is maybe not unlikely. However, it can, of course, change in the future. So with that, I finish my little talk.
Excellent. Thanks, Piret. I mean, there's a set of really interesting observations and very important ones too. Not discourse. Cyberwar is not always the best lens through which to look at these problems. It's a very diverse problem set involving a lot of different actors, and the examples you use about infrastructure and so on are perhaps, even though for analysts, that's the thing that really worries people, it's not what gets the public attention. You know, talking about infrastructure is boring. Talking about, you know, supply chains is dull and technical and so on. But it's absolutely essential to understanding, as you say, that most of what's going on that might be under this umbrella of cyberwar is actually very stealthy, as you say. It's what Martin Libicki calls sub rosa. It's kind of below the threshold. It's in what people call the gray zone. It's involving a whole range of actors and different types of technical infrastructures. And it's very complex. And as you say, you know, we need to improve our space. We need to improve our arguments as well about how we understand what's happening in those environments. And certainly, you know, the more data and evidence we can gather, the better for all of us. I'm sure that the audience has got some points they'd like to raise, and I've got a couple of questions. Thank you, Piret. I've got a couple of questions in the Q&A here. Can you hear me? I went off there. With the attribution problem, how can a country distinguish even the players in this game? And secondarily, if you can distinguish whether something's cyber warfare or cyber terrorism or perhaps something else. So with attribution, how can a state entity decide even who's playing the game against them? Which of you would like to consider that?
I'll give it a go first. So there are a couple of dimensions here when we think about attribution. First, there's a point that has now been frequently made, is that, yes, attribution is indeed a very tedious process, but it's not impossible, and it's not the case that the attribution problem exists and we can't attribute actors. In fact, when we think about many of the most severe or most significant cyber operations which took place over the last decade, most of them have been attributed. Of course, severity and attribution are correlated. If an attack is more severe, you're more likely to put resources into it to find out who is behind it. And so, yes, with that in mind, it's important to not make this, to exaggerate this problem that exists, but it's of course the case that often in these attribution cases or general operations that there is a period where, at least for the public, it's not directly clear who is behind it. And it is also the case that we don't have equal insight in what certain actors are doing in this space. So that leads to difficulties when we think about giving policy options, and I think everyone has to be very cautious with that. To quote Jason Healy on that, sometimes you don't know who is punching first or who is punching back. And so when someone says we need to respond to maybe an Iranian actor, it's not always clear if another Western actor has conducted an operation against Iran before. So I'll leave it there, and I'll give an opportunity to respond.
Yeah, I mean, it used to be said that attribution was always a problem because all we were thinking about was forensics. And there's an awful lot more to attribution than just the technical aspects, right?
Yes, and indeed, it's often discussed as a Sherlock Holmes process where you get the puzzle pieces together and then to find out who is behind it. Now, of course, that type of Sherlock Holmes process does exist and is going on, but we shouldn't forget about a second type of attribution, right? And that second type of attribution is what a lot of more mature states are doing, which is you're already in the adversary's networks and you see the attack going out. Now, that second one gives you a much higher level of certainty as to who is behind the attack. However, you're much less likely to discuss that in public, that you have that visibility.
Yes, because you don't want the enemy to know how you know. Piret, if I can turn to you for a question from David Waring, and I know this is something that NATO is generally quite concerned with. He asks, how active are foreign powers in infiltrating social media threads and influencing online conversations, and how effective is that tactic in sowing social division? I appreciate that's not strictly a CCD COE thing, but I know that this is of great concern to NATO and of course to EU and to member states. Is that something you can comment on?
Yes, just let me point out that there is another center of excellence in Riga, which publishes quite a lot of studies on this. And from what I know, they are very active, and especially there is one study regarding Twitter and using the automated postings in English and Russian language, and also using fake personas there. So I think what is more concerned are those kind of closed groups where we don't really have access, such as in various social media platforms, and perhaps the encrypted channels as well. And the second part, at how effective this is very hard, of course, again, to assess. I think it depends on the target audience. In some cases, for example, to look at the Russian propaganda regarding Sputnik 5, then it is, I don't know if it's it shows the effectiveness, but for Estonian Russian-speaking population, it's regarding this vaccine is regarding very highly. So especially those in the northeastern part of Estonia who watch Russian channels. And so I think there is at least some impact, which we have to consider.
It's incredibly difficult to measure, of course, and that's going to be an ongoing project for a lot of academics and state actors as well. I mean, before you came online, Piret, Max was making the very salient point that sometimes players in a game don't understand precisely what game they are each playing and what the other actor is playing. And when we think about Russia and the West, for example, we've been talking about cyber and information as two separate things for quite a long time, in a way that the Russians have not. Could you perhaps explain to a lay audience what the implications of that are? Because it speaks to this issue of social media, information operations, cyber-enabled information operations, and it's something that NATO is very active in. Could you just give us a brief explanation of why that difference matters?
Yes, I think I already actually tried to make this point earlier, that we tend to focus on those high-end cyber attacks, such as physical damage or casualties or taking out electric grids and so on. But Russia, because of the limitations and also because of the intent, actually prefers using technical cyber tools in order to have information psychological effects. So we see this for over decades, and we see that they are more and more advanced and sophisticated. But I think the worry here is that it kind of already loses its attractiveness among politicians and media and so on. We take it as business as usual, and we we regard this as most mundane activity and maybe pay less attention. So I think we shouldn't neglect that.
Yeah, but it's interesting the way that Russia has thought of cyber and information as something coherent, and but the West has generally split the two for all sorts of institutional and organizational reasons. But the weird thing is that in the West, we've been talking about effects in, let's say, military terms and non-military ways for 30 odd years. And it's only now we're getting to the point, exactly as you say, Piret, that we're thinking about effects and harms in terms of social harms, psychological effects, cognitive effects, and so on, in a slightly different register. And I think we are inevitably going to be getting a lot closer to the way, for example, Russia views this environment. I know that's not going to put a smile on any American's face, but it's almost inevitable that you have to be able to know, you have to understand the way that your adversary thinks. And we are now at that point. I'm absolutely certain of that in Western militaries, and I know NATO understands this as well, but it seems to have taken us quite a long time to get there. Excuse me. If I can switch a little bit to a question from Michael, and maybe he asks, do you see any signs of ethical considerations in the emerging institution of cyber conflict? I assume that means the institutions engaged in cyber conflict, by which I think that might mean state institutions. And luckily, someone on this call has written quite a lot about certain institutions like cyber commands and so on, that are involved in this space. And I'm going to ask Max first, then I'm going to come to Piret. But Max, I mean, how are kind of military/intelligence cyber commands, state institutions engaged in cyber conflict, what are their ethical considerations when it comes to conducting cyber operations, both defensive and offensive?
Yeah, that's a very good question. It's certainly not a level playing field, meaning that cyber commands did not play by the same rules, and that has implications. It reminds me of a comment that a US commander once made at the first Cyber Command Symposium in the US, where he drew a square and he said, this is the box of all the activity we could do. And this is this small box he drew then again of all the activity we are allowed to do. And perhaps he's exaggerating, and certainly it has changed over the last few years as to the directives, as to how US can operate. But it is the case indeed that certain actors are more or less constrained in their operations, are more willing to take risks around collateral damage, are more willing to avoid certain targets. Now, the interesting point here, is that you have to connect that to actors' capabilities. And I think that is not often well understood, because the countervailing tension that exists is the tension that exists is that for every additional, maybe even ethical constraint or normative constraint that you add to it, or general constraint, for instance, you want to minimize collateral damage and only specifically target one actor, and you want to achieve specifically a certain type of effect at a certain point in time. For each constraint you add, you almost disproportionately increase the requirements to conduct the operation. Suddenly, a lot more testing is involved. Suddenly, a lot more operational planning is involved with your legal team and so on. And I think that kind of disconnect is not always well understood.
Yeah, I mean, Piret, that raises a really interesting point from the alliance perspective, is that how do you get all the allies on board, if you like, looking in the same direction when they all come from such different national contexts?
Yes, that is, what is our job here in Center of Excellence, to raise this issue and arrive to some kind of common understanding. But I would want to make the distinction, being maybe more direct than Max was, that between the democratic and authoritarian countries that, for example, in the use of AI or other emerging and disruptive technologies, that I think, for example, if you talk about lethal autonomous systems, then Western countries have taken certain clear positions, which I consider are moral or ethical. However, I'm not sure that countries from other with other values are doing the same. And for example, if you take NotPetya, maybe the GRU officers who designed the malware were thinking ethically, but they still had that collateral damage because they didn't know that other companies are also using Ukrainian taxpayer software. So the damage was global. And so even if you have ethical considerations, it may not be possible to follow them in practice. But I also wanted to say that in terms
very
of
briefly, if you will.
Yes, in terms of the cyber commands, then I think at least in NATO, legal restrictions and are always part of the deal, or it's always considered. Every action is considered in terms of what legal frameworks permits to do. So
yeah, absolutely. But I think that very, very neatly wraps up in the sense that this is an incredibly complex area, and getting states who are even, long-standing allies to do the same thing is a constant challenge. Imagine doing that with 193 plus countries. It's a huge global security challenge, and it's not one that's going to go away. So thank you to our panelists. Thank you to the questions from the audience. I hope you've enjoyed it, but we're out of time. Goodbye.